stronger than that. Trouble comes a screaming, we always holler back.
I want people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves.
Say is quote made in China.
Most of the jobs will come from China.
When was the last time you saw a product made in the USA?
Tear down this wall.
Good morning and welcome again to the FairTax Summit. Any of the information throughout the day you can get at fairtaxsummit.com. If you forget to write something down later, if you have questions later, there may be a place on there if those are answered. We are going to get right to the program here and start with our first speaker. One of Indiana's favorite sons, a geologist by trade, a lover of America Revolutionary and Civil War history, and the former Indiana State Treasurer, Richard Mourdock.
Speech or presentation, and seeing that video, I already feel a little bit, like, oh man, I got a challenge here in front of me today. But when Dave called me a number of months ago and asked me to do this, I did not hesitate to say yes, because those words IRS, that especially this time of year that we see those letters IRS and we feel, Internal Revenue Service, I'll tell you, when I see those letters, I think institution restricting success. That's what the IRS is all about these days. And you're going to see throughout the day today a lot of electronic presentations, a lot of very modern stuff. And Dave asked me to speak a little bit about history, which of course I love to do, and especially about tax history. So I want to share a few thoughts along that line, kind of bring you from where we began this to where we are. And let me apologize in advance a bit, because some of you have heard me speak before. No, I may not sound quite like myself today. I shared with some of you out in the lobby there. I had a wonderful 10-day motorcycle trip down in southwest Texas that just ended a little less than a week ago. And I had 4 buddies who went with me, and it's where I first fell in love with geology years ago. It's called Big Bend National Park. Most of you have never heard of it. If you picture the outline of Texas in your mind, start at that very western point, which is El Paso, and then of course the Rio Grande River runs to the southeast, and then it makes that big bend. Okay, that's where we're talking about. It's the Chihuahuan Desert and the Chisos Mountains. And I told my buddies there was a money-back guarantee if we go down there and there's rain, because it's a desert and it's the dry season. It didn't rain, it snowed. So the cold that I have is a little bit of a remnant from that. So if I have a sneeze or two during all this, please forgive me. I want to start our talk a little bit about the history of taxation to remind you this is not a new topic. And there are those, certainly I think in this audience, who would say there's never been anything good come from taxation. And I would point out that that's not correct. The entire mathematical science of geometry is a result of taxation. Thousands of years ago, when the pharaohs were getting ready to tax those who managed their lands, they had to come up with some equal way, because lands were put off in parcels and they were different sizes, and they wanted to come up with some fair system, so they had some of their scholars assign the task and to figure out the area of these polygons. They actually started to develop the science of geometry, which we have from taxation. And again, just to make the point that it's not a new thing, why were Joseph and Mary on that journey so many years ago? It was to go to be a poll. Remember, Herod had that poll, but really it wasn't so much a poll to count people like we think of as a census today. It was so they could be taxed. So taxes have been around a while. In fact, I've often thought if Christ were to return today in Indiana, and he were looking for disciples, if he were looking for a replacement of Matthew, who was a tax collector, I thought Christ would probably go to the BMV and try to do a little recruiting there, because certainly they are tax collectors more than anything else. Well, when this country was first being populated by those from Europe, taxes were not a big issue. And why is that? During the early days, during the latter years of the 17th century, it's because most of those people who come here from Europe were in fact on a commercial venture. It was the Plymouth Bay Company and the Massachusetts Bay Company. And they came here to make money for the proprietors of those companies back in England, and they were the ones paying the taxes. So the people who were here in what are today the States weren't actually seeing it firsthand. They weren't having to write the check. They were just part of the larger organization. But of course, after the start of the 18th century, things began to change. As more and more people came here, it became more populated. What really started to get the fires burning a bit was the fact that incredible, It's almost an innate sense of Americans to organize and to have their own representatives and they began to form their own local governments. And they were paying taxes to those local governments. And you know what? None of them were complaining because they saw that they had people there firsthand, right down the street from them perhaps, who were working for them, doing those necessary things that government would do, and they were willing to pay the price for it. But the rub began when they started to see there was, in fact, a sense of double taxation. Because not only were they paying for their local governments and whatever powers they were being given, but they realized they were paying those people back in London for the services they were providing. And throughout the early part of the 18th century, those services became more and more important. It says red-coated soldiers were in the colonies to protect against the Native Americans who were getting more and more restless because they saw what was happening. And most of the civil order and protection that those British soldiers were providing were against those restless Native Americans. But you know, there is that sense of Americanism, I think, that says we can always do it better. And so they formed local militias. And then they started to think, why are we paying these guys, right? I'm sure they had that sense that many of us have. Why have the 30% solution, which is to say you send $1 to Washington, you get 30 cents back? Only then it was the London solution. They were sending £1 to London only to get back a few pence of service. And so they started to get a little bit restless. But those in Parliament felt they had to pay for what they were getting. And so in 1765, the Stamp Act was passed, which was the first real effort at direct taxation of American colonists by the Brits. And in a sense, that 1765 Stamp Act was pretty restricted. It was a direct tax on individuals. Whenever they had a legal contract, whenever they had a piece of land, whenever they had any kind of thing that had to run through what today we would consider a court system, there was a tax, a stamp had to be put on it that ruled it was official, that the contract was complete or the land was purchased, and that stamp came at a price. And there was a lot of rebellion in the colonies almost immediately. So much so that within 2 years, the Parliament repealed it. But it didn't solve the problem. Because as things were developing here in this country, things were starting to take a different direction in England as well. Do we have any fans here of Downton Abbey? Any of you watch Downton Abbey? Yeah, a few hands, okay. Well, if you've been watching that show, it takes place in the early 20th century. It's about the Lord of the Manor, Lord Grantham, and his family. And Lord Grantham is over this incredible estate, this English estate, and they live in this beautiful abbey. And the story involves how they try to pass that on, only there's no son, there's no heir. And the 3 daughters have to find someone. And it's a wonderful story. Not that I know much about it, not that I'm an addict, but I can tell you all the characters and I'll save you from that. But even back in the 18th century, that system was starting to fall apart a little bit, where the people who were those lords went to their representatives, which in England is called the House of Lords, and said, hey, we've got too many taxes here, and you've got to ease the tax burden. So the English Parliament was kind of letting up on their own folks, but they needed money from somewhere. So where did they look? Back at the colonies, not just here in North America, but around the world. They began to assess more and more taxes. And after they had to repeal the Stamp Act of 1765, just 2 years later, they came back with another act called the Townshend Act, which was named after the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Treasurer of England, if you will. And the Townshend Act was put on lead and silver and glass and a lot of commodities that had to be imported into the colonies. And oh yes, on tea. But it was not a direct tax. In other words, if you bought some lead or if you bought some glass, you as the consumer weren't paying the tax. It was the captain of the ship who brought it over, and at the time of the offloading, he had to pay it. Now, of course, ultimately the consumer paid. We all know that all taxes ultimately go to the end user. But it kind of placated things a bit because it wasn't a direct tax. But it too was seen as very, very unpopular, and people started to boycott those goods. But the Brits still needed the money. So my favorite tax that they came up with, 1773, the tea tax. Now you know a part of the story here, I'm sure. Tea Party members. But you may not know, and I love this part of the story. It was to offset a government bailout. It really was. It was a bailout. It was a government enterprise called the East India Tea Company. It was run by the government. And it was going to India and bringing back tea to the British Empire. But guess what? Because it was run by the government, it wasn't very efficient. And costs kept going higher and higher and higher. And what happens? Well, the market works, whether the government thinks it will or not. And a black market developed. And there were smugglers of tea who would take their own ships and go to India and buy tea and bring it back to England. Now I have this picture in my mind, and I'm sure it was something like this. The little public street market there in London in Piccadilly. And Mrs. Patmore, those of you who watch Downton Abbey will get the connection. Mrs. Patmore is going through the little street market buying supplies, and someone says, "Psst, hey lady, come here." And she kind of backs up like, "What? Come here, I want to show you something." And he takes her around the corner. He says, "Hey, I got something here." And he holds out this little cup of tea. She goes, "Oh, no. He says, "No, go ahead, the first one's free." And she might sit there, "Man, that's good tea." And then he opens up his bag and says, "I got 5 kilos of pure Ceylon black. Just came off the boat. The best tea you can buy, right here it is. Just picked sun-dried. And I'll sell it to you for 66% of the government price." So what does she do? She buys the tea. And back at home, Mr. Carson rewards her for saving money. Now what happened? The East India Tea Company was going broke because it couldn't sell its own tea at the government price. And so they needed to bail it out. So they passed the Tea Act that led, when that shipload of East India tea arrived in the Boston Harbor, to the dumping of the tea. And you know what came after that. Those colonists began to organize to what ultimately became the American Revolution. It all began over taxation, over trying to support a government that was in the private markets, or what should have been the private markets, and yet was operating so efficiently that the citizens, plainly and simply, though they did not have training in economics, they came to understand there could be a better way. The revolution took place. And as you know, coming out of the American Revolution, our first form of government was not that Constitution that we so revere. It was the Articles of Confederation. And in the Articles of Confederation, it specifically says that alliance had no power whatsoever to tax citizens within the individual colonies, or to tax the individual colonies. So you had this new form of government that had no direct taxation powers. Its only source of income would be tariffs on imported or exported goods that the states decided to voluntarily pay. How many states do you suppose volunteered to make payment? None. Now, a few states that were fairly prosperous were able to pay off their Revolutionary War debts. And by the way, the Revolutionary War debts, between what the states owed, those colonies, and between what the federal government owed, amounted to the almost unbelievable figure of $79 million. That was the indebtedness for the cost of the American Revolution. There were a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation, because those colonies were still operating more as colonies, and there wasn't that sense of unification that would cause them collectively to be seen as a country. Everybody was making a deal for themselves. And a couple of the colonies, those that were more prosperous, actually were able to pay off their own war debts. In any economic crisis that results in a vacuum, there will always be somebody who tries to rise to power to fix the problem. And when the Constitutional Convention that led to our Constitution began, that person was effectively Alexander Hamilton. One of the things that he spoke of continually was the idea of what became known as assumption. If they formed this new federal government, that government would assume all those debts that were just crushing the colonies. Now imagine you show up from far off Virginia or one of the Carolinas, and you have this debt, and you know you can't pay it off, and all of a sudden somebody's saying, hey, here's a way to pay it off. You're going to be listening to that person. And so when the Constitution was ultimately passed, part of the deal was that the federal government would assume all those debts and start taking care of them. But again, there was no direct taxation, of course. The only way they had to do it was with tariffs. As you all know, one of the main arguments back in the colonial days, even before the Articles, was taxation without representation is tyranny. People didn't like seeing their money sent to England, and they had no say in how it would be collected or how it would be spent. Taxation without representation is tyranny. Well, under the new federal government that was formed, they quickly came to realize that tariffs alone on imported and exported goods, while there was money coming in, it still wasn't going to take care of that cumulative debt, so they had to find some other ways to raise money from the federal government. And so, in 1791, for the first time, the United States government assigned a tax on a product. Anyone know what the product was? Whiskey. It was a whiskey tax. Now, the tax was inherently unfair. And by the way, a great name from American history that I have to say I'd never heard of until last night, or Rick Barr is. We were involved in a board game called We the People, and the name Herman Husband came up. I'd never heard of Herman Husband. It turned out he was a landowner, a patriot, an evangelical preacher who felt sorry for the farmers who were being assessed the whiskey tax. Well, why would farmers be assigned, well, first of all, why would farmers be making whiskey? Is a good question. And secondly, why would it be unfair to them? Well, two things were happening here. First of all, there was a lot of whiskey being produced on the East Coast by big-time distillers. And they had a chance to pay a flat rate for their tax. Regardless how many gallons of whiskey they made, they paid the tax, and it's over. But individual farmers had to pay by the gallon. Now, that may not sound like a big deal, but understand the farmers who were making whiskey out of their excess corn and grain. And this was largely on the west side of the Appalachian Mountains, especially in western Pennsylvania. And they said no. Just to make it one part more perhaps interesting and comprehensible, why were they making whiskey? It wasn't because they were all alcoholics and drunks. No, it's because whiskey was basically their currency. When you were west of the Appalachians in 1790, there wasn't a lot of currency floating around. And it was a barter system. And people would barter barrels of whiskey. So they were being assigned this tax on a per gallon basis. They didn't have any cash anyway, and now they're being told they have to pay this tax. And it was grossly unfair. And Herman Husband went rushing to western Pennsylvania, started to organize these people into what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. It was the first time in American history a product had been taxed. And get this. Now, here's a stellar politician. Whether you agree with what he did or not, you have to appreciate him as a politician. George Washington, President of the United States, became the only commander-in-chief ever in American history at that time to put on his military uniform and get on the horse and lead a group of soldiers into western Pennsylvania to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. The only American president who's ever served truly in a military function as president. Now the good news is by the time he got there, the Whiskey Rebellion had kind of petered out and everybody had gone home. But it was that sense, and I'm sure those farmers felt it, maybe taxation with representation ain't such a good deal either. Because they had people representing them, and yet they had brought back this terrible tax, which turned out to be relatively short-lived. The rebellion did work in a sense. The representatives did hear them. So they had to literally raise themselves to arms to be heard. From 1790 until basically the Civil War, the only real income for the federal government was from tariffs. And it worked both ways. Things coming in, things going out. The real problem with tariffs, even back then, was they tend to be terribly protectionist. When they would put a tariff on something to prevent a product from coming in, it meant that those who were producing that product in this country obviously were being protected, but it didn't lead to innovation. It didn't lead to lower cost because they were covered. And yet still there was enough money being generated until the Civil War broke out to cover the cost of government. During the Civil War, that one of the most fascinating Americans you'll ever read about, Salmon P. Chase. He was an opponent to President, in the 1860 run-up to the election, he was an opponent to Abraham Lincoln for the presidency. He was a one-time governor of Ohio, a former senator. He's an arrogant little guy who said that he always looked like he had an upset stomach. He always had this pained expression on his face. When he was 13 years old, he told his mother that he was going to be so famous people would remember his name for 200 years. How many of you have ever heard of Salmon P. Chase? A few hands. How many of you heard J.P. Morgan Chase? That's Salmon P. He was a brilliant financier. Abraham Lincoln appointed him to the head of the U.S. Treasury. And he worked with Congress to implement, yes, the first federal income tax.
Hunkered in the sand, middle of nowhere. The war was raging and he didn't think he'd be spared. He told his buddy, guess this is the end. His buddy looked at him, said, don't say that again, 'cause we're stronger than that. Trouble comes a screaming, we always holler back. Don't let it get us down or throw us off track. When we stand together, we're strong.
Are issuing a permit to them and then doing unannounced inspections of those establishments. In addition to the permanent establishments, we also do inspections and issue permits for our temporary establishments that